Hi, welcome to tonight's meeting of the Oregon Archaeological Society. If you're not familiar with us, we are a nonprofit organization established in 1951, and we emphasize the importance of working with archaeological professionals to promote the advancement of archaeology in the Northwest through education and public service. So tonight's presentation is by Jordan Pratt. It's titled Hasketts and Crescents, an examination of the open-air Paleoindian occupation at Weed Lake Ditch. Jordan is a PhD candidate at Texas A&M and has worked in the Harney Basin for 8 years. I was lucky enough to work with Jordan a few years ago when she was at Rimrock with Pat O'Grady. And so I'm really glad to have her back and see her again and find out what she's been up to. A few other things we have going on is that I want to remind people that the Jones Scholarship and the Loring Grant Awards are coming due on February 1st. I'd like to encourage everybody to apply for those who's eligible. There's information online at the Oregon Archaeological Society website. Mr. Minnick has done a great job of maintaining that with lots of good information on our training programs and other things going on with the group. Training is going on this year online. It's Archaeology for the Curious and basic training. Feel free to look up whatever you want to on the websites or Instagram, Twitter, etc. David's done a great job. Next month, February 2nd, Melissa Darby will be presenting on Thunder Go North, the hunt for Sir Francis Drake's Fair and Good Bay, which is a great story. I think you'll really enjoy that. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Jordan, and go ahead, Jordan.
Okay, cool. Thanks for that intro. Let me see, I'm gonna try to figure out how to share and then actually start the PowerPoint. Okay, can everyone see it? Or did I not actually hit share?
There you go.
See it? Okay, cool. I knew we'd get there in the end. Awesome. So, as was already stated, I'm going to spend today talking about my ongoing dissertation research in the Harney Basin at the Weed Lake Ditch site. And I'd like to start by just saying a big thank you. I recognized a lot of the faces when everyone was popping in, and it's fun to see everyone. It's been a long time since I've seen a lot of you, but I've worked with a lot of you at Rimrock, as was already stated, and then as some of you may have heard, I've worked with some folks out in the Catlow Valley on an ill-fated potential job where we were digging in the direct sunlight, and it was a little rough. But it's always fun to work with the OAS, and I am really happy to be able to talk to y'all today. So just a little bit of an overview. I'm gonna briefly go over kind of the problem and why open air Western STEM sites like Weed Lake Ditch are really important for our understanding of the Paleoindian period in the Great Basin. So part of that will just be a focus on the Harney Basin specifically, which is where Rimrock Draw is, as well as Weed Lake Ditch, Niles, and several other stratified buried stemmed sites. And then the majority of the time, I'm just going to talk about Weed Lake Ditch and the different materials that we've been finding. I've been working at Weed Lake Ditch since 2017. So we took a brief hiatus this year because of COVID, unfortunately. But I'll go into a little bit more of the overall project and why I ended up at Weed Lake Ditch specifically. And then just talk about why the site is important and what I'm hoping to do in the future. So I'm not going to belabor this point a lot because I know you all have talked with several other people who are studying Western stemmed technology in the Great Basin. But for those of you who may be not completely familiar, or just so we all have a quick refresher and we're starting on the same page, what we know, folks who are studying the peopling of the Americas, which is what I do at Texas A&M University, is that there is movement of people from the Pacific into the East Pacific, I should say, the East Asia into Thuringia, and then into the Americas. There has been ongoing debate for a very long time about the route in which people got into North America and South America specifically, either through the ice-free corridor, which you can see here, obviously. This is the traditional view of the peopling of the Americas, is that folks are coming from Thuringia and coming from Alaska, going down the ice-free corridor and populating North America. And the traditional view is that these individuals are using Clovis technology and have a robust big game hunting emphasis. What we've seen in the last several decades is an acknowledgement that there are sites in the Great Basin and in other parts of North and South America that are either coeval or predate Clovis. And that includes a large number of stemmed sites that are found in the Great Basin and on the Columbia River Plateau. So sites like Paisley Caves, Cooper's Ferry, Bonneville Estates, and Smith Creek Caves, as well as others. And what that may indicate is that instead of coming through the ice-free corridor, instead that people are coming down the coast and then moving into the interior from the Pacific itself. And I will just say there's a lot of work that needs to be done to refine and kind of get at both of those potential movements of people into the Americas. And it's likely that there's a very complex history that includes potentially people migrating from both places. Although it looks like there are materials that are in the Great Basin that are early enough that it would indicate that they are coming from the Pacific, because this predates the opening of the ice-free corridor. And then just a little bit more, what we can see with a lot of these stemmed sites is that there are really robust lithic assemblages. A lot of the assemblages are found on the surface, but there are many stratified sites, including rock shelter sites, cave sites, and some open air sites. And what we know when we look at Western stemmed sites and technology overall is that there's a lot of different things going on. Obviously, the most obvious thing is that there are large stemmed points, like you can see here. These stem points have various names, the most common being Haskett, Cougar Mountain, Parman, Lynn Coulee, and Wind Dust, as well as Lake Mojave and Silver Lake to the south. We also see that there are these lunate tools that we refer to as crescents here, as well as just a ton of other non-diagnostic tools that would have been used, like scrapers to process hides, gravers to perforate things, drills, notches, just retouched flakes, all things that could be used to chop, process, and basically make a living during this time period. What we also know is that we're lucky that some of the cave and rock shelter sites have really good preservation, and they include perishable artifacts, some cordage, as well as some osseous technology, which we'll talk a little bit more about because there are bone tools that were found at Reed Lake Ditch. But these tools often include things like bone needles, and in rare instances, there's one example of a foreshaft that would have been used with a Haskett point from Sentinel Gap. So a couple more things just so we're all on the same page before I actually dive into the Harney Basin. There are two main tools that are found at Reed Lake Ditch that I just kind of want to go over. The first are Haskett points, and you can see from this image, which is redrawn by Teresa Riston, that Haskett points are large stemmed points. They don't have shoulders, so it's all one continuous surface. And what we know is that these points often have lateral edge grinding along the margins, which is where they would have been hafted or attached to an atlatl dart or to a spear itself, most likely to a spear. And they have a couple of other diagnostic attributes. One, you can see they have these really broad flakes that meet at the midline. And we refer to these as collateral bifacial flaking to the midline. And it is a diagnostic attribute of Haskett technology. We see it really commonly on most Haskett points. They also tend to be pretty thick. They're often diamond shaped in cross section, and they have kind of a contracting stem. So they're widest here, and then they contract down towards the base. The original Haskett typology was defined by Butler at the Haskett site, go figure, in Idaho. And he defined two different types. You can see them here, type 1 and then type 2. Type 2 generally tend to be longer, and they are almost bi-pointed. So there's less of a difference between the overall size. I will say that most folks today don't really distinguish between type 1 and type 2. Instead, they're kind of subsumed together. There's been a lot of work on looking at Hasketts in the kind of last couple of decades. And in part, this is because we recognize that Hasketts are found at a lot of these early important Western stem sites, including Paisley Caves, Conley Caves, Cougar Mountain Caves, Sentinel Gap, and several sites in the Eastern Great Basin as well. In general, they tend to be similar in size to Clovis. And they also, and this is really exciting, in the last kind of 3 or 4 years, shout out to Richie Rosenkrantz, but he has done a lot of work redating sites and putting together a kind of Bayesian model, a statistical model, to try to determine when Hasketts were first occurring in the Great Basin. And what he's found, in combination with the results from a lot of other folks who are radiocarbon dating their sites, is that a lot of the Haskett sites that we are finding, especially in the Northwestern Great Basin, which is where I'm doing my research, date between about 12,600 to 11,675 years ago. And so this is really kind of pretty much in the Younger Dryas period. So it's associated with the cold snap at the end of the Ice Age, right before the onset of our most recent geologic period. And they're not necessarily the earliest stem points in the entire Great Basin. There are some stem points at Cooper's Ferry that are referred to as Lead points that are older. And there's undiagnostic stem points at other sites like Paisley Caves that are older than some of the Haskett sites. They may later be attributed to a specific style, but for now we associate Haskett points with the Younger Dryas. The other technology that I want to talk about before I really dive in are crescents. I know a lot of you who've done work out in the basin, who've gone on surveys with the BLM and stuff, you may have found crescents. You've definitely seen them probably at Rimrock. They've been found a lot there. If you haven't had the chance to go out and do any field work out there, just know that crescents are pretty common. They're most commonly associated with wetlands and pluvial lake margins. And they're found throughout the Northwest. There's a lot of crescents that are found on the Channel Islands as well as throughout the Great Basin. They're often associated with different water systems that seem to be on the Pacific Flyway. So it's been hypothesized by some archaeologists that these are directly associated with waterfowl hunting. And you can see from these images that there's a lot of range and kind of variability in the shape of crescents. Some crescents are really eccentric. There are crescents that have been found in California that are zoomorphic. So there's one that's shaped like a bear. There's several that have lots of notches. And these are likely more decorative than they are potentially useful necessarily. But we also know that the majority of the crescents come in these three kind of styles that you can see right here. So type 1 is referred to as a crescent, a crescent or a quarter moon. And you can see that it tends to have more of a concavity here as opposed to half moon crescents, which are more flattened. And then these butterfly crescents, which have multiple concavities, as you can see there. A lot of crescents are made on more durable materials. So they tend to be made on cryptocrystalline silicates or cherts. And they're very complicated. Everyone's favorite thing is to try to determine what crescents might be for. And spoiler alert, archaeologists can't really decide necessarily. They definitely don't agree. Throughout time, there have been different hypotheses that crescents were potentially jewelry, potentially that they were scrapers that were used to process different plant materials. And I should say, sorry too, I didn't mention this before, crescents are often ground kind of in the midline here. And so it's hypothesized that potentially that means that they were hafted. And this image down here shows different potential ways that crescents were hafted. So either with the points facing upwards, downwards, or sometimes even people hypothesize that they were kind of hafted to the side with the points kind of pointing in one direction. But yeah, so some people, because of the grinding, think that they are associated with projectile technology and that they would have been used either on throwing sticks or as transverse projectile points to hunt waterfowl specifically. And this has kind of been bolstered by some experimental archaeological projects, which have indicated that a lot of the breakage patterns that we see on crescents that we find are analogous with points that have been basically used as projectiles and shot at waterfowl. But I should also note that there is evidence from ethnographic accounts, including ethnographic accounts of the Northern Paiute groups who lived in the Stillwater Marsh area in Nevada, that crescents were used to harvest plants, specifically to harvest willow bark, or to scrape root skins, or to do some sort of processing associated with plants. Although some of those ethnographic accounts also do mention the possibility of bird points. So they definitely could be used for both. And what we'll see kind of later on is that maybe there's enough diversity to explain multiple different hypotheses. Okay, so now just a little bit about why I am interested at looking at open air sites specifically. So you may have noticed from me kind of rapidly going through a lot of those sites that we talked about in the Great Basin that are early, that a lot of them are cave or rock shelter sites. And that's great because those sites have amazing preservation. They tend to have really deep buried deposits. So they represent the end of the Ice Age almost through the present, depending on where you are. But it's also a little bit problematic because cave and rock shelter sites only represent one specific place on the landscape. Which means that if we don't have buried open air sites in variable regions, we're likely missing some of the behaviors and potentially some of the diversity of what folks were doing in the past. And so if we really want to get at how old certain projectile points are, or if we want to understand how people were using the entire landscape as they were moving across it through their seasonal rounds, we need to be excavating variable sites from different locations. And so obviously some of that would be open air sites on lake margins. Traditionally, Western stemmed technology has been associated with pluvial water resources, but it also means going to the uplands and potentially excavating sites there. So looking at the record, we can see that most of the stemmed sites that overlap with Clovis are cave and rock shelter sites. Obviously, there are some exceptions, like Cooper's Ferry, for example, but the majority of them are cave and rock shelter sites. So with that in mind, I'm going to kind of transition towards the Harney Basin. So this map shows you the hydrographic Harney Basin itself. So the outline on the map shows the hydrographic extent of the basin. So what that simply means is that these are the locations where the water is flowing down into Malheur Lake and then ultimately into Harney Lake. And I just wanted to show you all this map because it kind of shows where Niles and Biting Fly and Weed Lake Ditch are, which are the 3 sites I'm looking at for my dissertation, compared to some of the other stemmed and Paleoindian sites that are located in the larger Northern Great Basin. So you can see that we are to the east of the Conley Caves, Paisley Caves, and then also the Dietz site. And then specifically Niles and Weed Lake Ditch are kind of to the southeast of Rimrock Draw, as well as Sagehen Gap and Sheep Mountain, which are the sites that Pat O'Grady has been excavating that a lot of you have worked out throughout the last couple decades. So this region is really exciting because there is so much Paleoindian archaeology, and there's a really robust research program looking at that archaeology itself. So the BLM has really been integral in spearheading a lot of these research efforts. They've done a lot of survey throughout the larger region and have helped with the excavations at places like Rimrock as well as at Weed Lake Ditch. There's also been research in the basin kind of going back in the past in the late 1990s and the early 2000s. There was a research effort from the University of Nevada, Reno, where they were systematically surveying and then excavating sites, including Weed Lake Ditch. So likely I wouldn't be here if folks from UNR hadn't done previous work at these sites. But these sites that are on the map are all sites that have buried components. And so that's really important for us because when sites have buried components, potentially they have materials that can be dated, radiocarbon dated, so that we can get an idea of how old these sites are. Aside from these buried sites, there are a ton of open air sites that are surface sites where you find the artifacts just by surveying and looking around. And while these sites can be kind of relatively dated using obsidian hydration and other techniques, there's not a lot of explicit understanding of exactly how old they are. Despite this, it's really important that we do this research just so we can get an idea of what's out there. And Harney Basin specifically has over 1,400 different stemmed points that have been found on surveys throughout the larger region. This is including the Harney Basin, the Catlow Basin, and the Albert Basin. And that includes around 40 fluted points, as well as over 400 Parman points, around 30 to 40 Haskett points, and over 230 Crescent tools. And there's been a lot of research and resurveying of Niles and Biting Fly by the BLM. and they've recovered an additional 10 stemmed artifacts from the surface of Weed Lake Ditch. So there's a lot of STEM technology at these sites, which means that it's a really exciting place to kind of go back and look and try to figure out what exactly is going on. So a little bit more about the lakes themselves, if just so that we're all on the same page. So at its highest, Malheur Lake was around 1,500 square kilometers. And the high stand of this lake was likely around 4,124 feet. What we know is that we consider the Harney Basin to be part of the hydrographic Great Basin today, which simply means that it is internally draining and that all of the water is flowing back into the lake. However, at its high stand, it would have overflowed its sill and kind of flown down. Water would have flowed out into the Malheur River and then into the Snake and out to the Columbia ultimately. So at its high stand, Malheur was not internally draining. What we know today is that the gap or the sill for this high stand is at Malheur Gap, which is kind of, it's a little bit southeast of Crane, if any of you have ever been to the hot springs at Crane. So kind of southeast of Burns as well. And this gap would have been, is basically a location that was uplifted by tectonic activity. And it actually dammed the basin itself, which resulted in the large lake that we see at various points during the past. Unfortunately, the lake levels in Malheur, the Malheur Lake is just really not very well understood. So this map kind of shows projected levels at various times in the past. And then this diagram shows dated shoreline features. And what you can see is that there aren't really a lot of dated shoreline features, unfortunately, which means that we don't really have a super good understanding of when the lake was at its high stand and when it was much lower. But there has been some research that has shown that the high stand of 14,114 feet likely happened at the end of the Ice Age during the Younger Dryas period, right before the onset of the Holocene. So at about 11,000 years ago, it would have had this high stand and the entire lake basin would have been full. And what this means is that water from Malheur Lake would have flown through the Narrows into Mud Lake and then down into Harney Lake. Pluvial Lake Malheur is really unique when we look at it compared to some of the other late Ice Age lakes throughout the Great Basin, just because there's really different topography depending on what part of the lake you're on. So Malheur Lake, as you can see, this part of the lake is very wide and would have been generally pretty shallow, like no more than around 10 feet. So in this area, the lake kind of spread out instead of getting deeper. And then Harney Lake is kind of the opposite. So Harney Lake has really steep escarpments around it that kind of prevented the water from flowing out, which means that it ultimately got much deeper than the part that's near Malheur Lake. So it would have at times been probably max around 25 to 30 feet in depth. And this is kind of important. The reason why I'm talking about it is because it really affects where we would see marsh resources in the past. So we know that really steep lakes tend to have marsh features that are closer to the shorelines themselves, whereas more wide, broad, extensive parts of the lake would have likely had marsh resources more dispersed in little pockets of highlands where there were sediment and small islands, embayments, and things like that. Yeah, so hopefully there will be more geologic work in the Harney Basin to kind of get at these lake level high stands. That's not really something that I'm specifically focusing on right now. But I bring it up in part because the sites that we're interested in, including Weed Lake Ditch, are actually found just right above what would have been the high stand. So you can see they're at about 1,256 meters as opposed to the high stand level of around 1,254. So they're right on the lake margins, which would have affected how we look at them in the past. Okay, so Weed Lake Ditch was actually first identified in 1975. So we've known about this site for a really long time, and work has been going on off and on ever since then. So luckily, or unluckily for us as it may be, there was a ditch that was excavated manually by farmers in the region. And you can see it right here. And this ditch is connecting the Weed Lake Flat, which would have been an area that had water during the end of the Ice Age, down into Harney Lake and onto the playa itself. And I say that we're lucky because that's how the site was found. There were artifacts that were eroding out of the ditch, and you can see this is a kind of small image of the ditch itself. And so folks were finding artifacts on the base of the ditch and trying to figure out if they could see if they were from buried deposits higher up in the actual deposits of the ditch itself. One of the first more extensive excavations at Weed Lake Ditch was done by Keith Gear in the late 70s. And he found what he referred to as a bi point right here. And you can see it, it's a scanned picture, so it's not super great. But from just looking at the photograph, it looks like this point is probably could be qualified to be a Haskett point because it has that parallel oblique flaking that goes to the midline. It's generally got the morphological shape, and he did describe some grinding on it. And Keith Gear actually dated the site as well as this escarpment. So you can see that this is a higher topographic relief right here that extends down towards the ditch itself. Part of this is just from actual volcanic activity, and then part of it is actually an active beach ridge that was created by wave action from Malheur Lake itself and Harney Lake during the high stand. So this beach feature actually likely represents the high stand itself. And there are various different deposits that are associated with that high stand. And what's kind of cool is that you can see is that it kind of extends down in between Weed Lake Flat and the actual lake itself. So it creates kind of an embayment, and likely there were large marsh resources associated with the site itself. Yeah, so moving on. Teresa Riston is the other individual who did the majority of the work at Weed Lake Ditch. And she excavated Weed Lake Ditch as part of her master's thesis at the University of Nevada, Reno. And she actually went back to the site and decided to excavate there because she found a Haskett point eroding out of the site. So Keith Gear found a Haskett point eroding out of the site, Teresa Riston did as well. And you can see it's actually this point that's on this side. And so she excavated from 2000 to 2002, and she found 4 Haskett points in buried deposits, various other stemmed points, which you can actually see right here. So the bottom ones are what she defined as the Haskett points. These are the stemmed points that she found, the fragments, and then she also found a crescent point, which you can see here, as well as this interesting bone tool or bone bead potentially. So these artifacts are found at several different Younger Dryas Age sites throughout the region. They're found at Conley Caves. They're also found at Sentinel Gap, which is a site located in Washington. And the folks who excavated at Sentinel Gap interpret these artifacts to potentially be bone bead preforms. So you can kind of see there's a nubbin on the end, for lack of a technical term, which is where the bone was scored and then where it would have been snapped. And so their hypothesis is that these artifacts are being scored and snapped, and then potentially they're being drilled. And we'll talk about these a little bit more because we found one at Weed Lake Ditch as well. And then this kind of just shows overall the artifact density. So this is right along the ditch itself when Teresa was excavating. You can see that there's a lot of artifacts that are found actually east, kind of further away from the ditch, which is really good when we're looking at preservation of the site itself. Because unfortunately, the beauty to the ditch is that we find the artifacts eroding out and we know to dig there. The downside to the ditch is that the site is actively eroding out into the ditch, which is not great. So to a certain extent, we're doing a little bit of salvage along the ditch edge itself. Aside from finding diagnostics, Teresa actually found a lot of other artifacts. She found over 30 bifaces, various unifaces, and over 16,000 pieces of debitage. She also was able to radiocarbon date the site using gastropod or small shells. And she radiocarbon dated the site to about 11,397 years ago, to about 11,100 years ago. So unfortunately, gastropod is not the greatest material for dating. And that's because shell, especially when it's in open water systems like a lake, can intake carbon from the water, and that can kind of create issues with the age that you're getting from the shell itself. So often what we see when we compare shell dates to other terrestrial dates is that they tend to be older. Although one of the things that Riston noted was that a lot of the shell that she had dated was really, it was kind of decomposing. So she thought that that might actually mean that it was creating kind of potentially a slightly younger date. Regardless, she was able to date the site, which is, it's an important thing to have that marker, even if it's not an absolute thing that you can hang your hat on. She was also able to really get at the geology of the site itself. And I apologize because I know that this is really faint, but what you can see is right here is where the Haskett was eroding out of the ditch itself. And Riston noted that this actual stratum that the Haskett point was in, and ultimately where a lot of the cultural materials that she recovered were also recovered from this stratum, is that this is a stratum with a lot of gravel. It's pretty turbated, and what she interpreted was that this stratum was part of the active lake margin. So she interpreted this as being basically affected by waves coming off of Harney Lake and potentially storm surges that were pushing gravels up onto the site itself. You can see above that there's actually a weak soil here where there was a fairly stable surface, and then there's a second soil below that, I should say, and right above the Haskett point. And this will become important later when we look at what we're finding at Weed Lake Ditch itself. So in 2017, I actually went on a small hiatus from Rimrock and took the field school students from that year's field school out to Weed Lake Ditch, and we did some survey along the site, just kind of to look at it and to determine if there was the potential to do more excavation. And during that survey, we found several crescents on the surface, and then this is kind of just for funsies, we found a fossilized camel metapodial that was at the base of the ditch itself. So this is not at all associated with Weed Lake Ditch, aside from the fact that it's from the ditch, but I just thought it's cool because camels are cool. So because we could see that there was potential, we decided to come back in 2018 and start excavating at the site. And you can see from this map that we put in 7 units in 2018. These white units are actually Teresa Riston's units. And we went to the east of that. And we put in kind of a straight block of units and then 1 smaller unit out to the side. We were lucky enough to also find a Haskett point eroding out of the ditch, because apparently everyone who works at Wheat Lake Ditch must do that. So you can see this is one of my field school students up here who's excavating in this lower unit. And then kind of further down here along the ditch itself, there's a Haskett point right here, and that's this point. And we got lucky because it was kind of held in place by a root. So that was the first Haskett we found. And then we put in 1 more site during that first season. And we put it kind of in a weird spot. We put it way further east and south of the majority of the units that are up here. And that was because we actually found a fluted point on the surface right next to where we put in this site. And I apologize, this is a really dark picture, but it's a fluted point. It's not a true Clovis point. It's what we refer to as a Clovis variant or a fluted variant. Some researchers refer to them as sunshine fluted points, but they tend to be much more gracile. You can tell that this is definitely not very large. It's just over a centimeter, but it does have a diagnostic flute going up. So we thought, hey, why not see if there's anything over here? That was part of why we put the unit in over here. We also put the unit in over here because we thought potentially if this was the active lake margin, that if we went further east and there were cultural materials, they would be better protected from the actual wave action of the lake itself. So that was kind of our other reason for going back over there. And you can see, I just want to show you this too. So this shows the units and the stars are our datums, but it's really important to note that even though these sites are further east, they tend to be higher up. Generally, the landform slopes to the west. It slopes kind of west-northwest. So obviously this is the ditch itself, and there it basically gets higher the further away from the ditch you go. And that becomes important when we look at where we're finding the artifacts. So in addition to the Haskett point we found eroding out of the ditch, we found 2 other Haskett points from buried deposits. One of which, this one you can see right here, has a lot of impact damage and likely was used for hunting. We also found 4 crescents and 1 kind of not quite crescent shaped thing, but it's marginally ground right in the interior the way a crescent would be. So for now it's in our maybe category. And then what was really exciting is that in the far eastern unit, we found a bone needle, an eyed bone needle, which you can see down here. Bone needles are generally associated with the Younger Dryas cold period, likely because they were associated with clothing manufacture. Aside from finding that, we also find a lot of non-diagnostic tools, including various bifaces and a lot of scrapers and different amounts of debitage and really fragmented bones. The last kind of really exciting, cool thing that we found was this artifact right here, which we have identified potentially to be a stone pendant. So you can see right here that it would have actually snapped right around where it was kind of drilled and perforated there. So potential ornamentation at the site as well. And you can see that these are the students excavating right along the ditch itself. This is one of my students that is screening. The other unit is kind of over here. So it's substantially away from the ditch itself. And that it was important because a lot of the diagnostic tools that we found, including the crescents, came from this far eastern unit, whereas the Hasketts were coming from the western unit. And so in 2019, we kind of put in units to try to determine if the two parts of the site were actually connected. But before I get there, just a little bit, this is the profile that is of that western block along the ditch. And you can see that we didn't finish excavating all of the units, but what we do have is a stratigraphic profile that corresponds pretty well with what Teresa Riston had previously described. So we have this upper weak soil. There's not a lot of artifacts in this upper part. There's another weak soil here. Underneath that are deposits that were wind blown and then intermittently have sheet washing where water was running off them and over them, kind of creating laminations. And then the main cultural component is in this gravel layer that's down here. And this is where we're finding a lot of the diagnostic tools. And again, that really does correspond with how Teresa identified these stratigraphic units when she was excavating. And that was good for us because it really meant that what we were finding was associated with what she was finding as well. So in 2019, we came back to the site and we ended up only working in this eastern block. So this is my student Derek, and he's actually standing in the first unit that we put in over here where we found the bone needle and several crescents and scrapers and things like that. And so what I wanted to do was open up units around that to see, one, if there was more cultural material, and then two, if there were other things like Haskett points over here, or if what we were seeing was that there were only Hasketts near the ditch and only crescents away from the ditch for the most part. And so we spent about 8 weeks there in 2019 excavating these units, and we ended up doing things a little bit differently. You can see that this is one of my students named Kira, and she's actually going through the process of wet screening the artifacts. So in 2018, what we did was we wet screened a small portion of each unit as we were excavating. And that was because we wanted to use a finer mesh. So we used 1/16 inch mesh instead of 1/8 of an inch mesh, like we normally do if you have the shaking screens. And the reason why we did this was in part because Teresa Riston did it, and that was how she recovered the bone bead preform. But then also we found the bone needle in the wet screen. So we were recognizing that there were small artifacts at the site and they were likely only going to be found if we used the really small mesh. And so we decided to actually wet screen all of the quads and all of the material that we took out during 2019. And I have to give a lot of kudos to the BLM because they brought a water buffalo down to me so that we could use the water to screen the artifacts. And it is not a pretty road to drive a water buffalo down. So you can see these are the screens kind of laying out, the material in the bottom. What we would do is pick through the screens to get everything out, and we're actually, unfortunately, still picking through some of the screens because there's just a ton of material to get out. In 2019, it was a really exciting season because we basically replicated what we found in 2018, but at a much larger scale. So we ended up finding 3 additional Haskett points, as well as 9 additional crescents, all from buried deposits, 7 other stem points that haven't been typed to a specific type, either because it's only a base and we can't tell, or because I need to do a little bit more analysis, as well as another bone needle and a bone bead preform. So it was a really exciting season because what we could see is that the materials that we were finding in this eastern block were duplicating what was found along the ditch itself. And this is the profile from the eastern block. The other nice thing about the eastern block is that you don't have to excavate through kind of like 50 to 75 centimeters of non-cultural deposits. Instead, what we have is a really weak soil kind of right here that has underneath it aeolian deposits with that same sheet washing. And then the highly turbated gravels right here that may be associated with the active lake margin. And then more aeolian deposits beneath that. What's interesting in the Eastern Bloc is that we don't have the active beach gravels going all the way across the units. And what this indicates to me is that potentially we actually hit the extent of where the storm surges were reaching. And so we aren't getting those gravels. It's a little bit hard to see, but the blue dots are flakes, the green dots are bone, and then we have Hasketts in the pink stars and Crescents in the purple stars. And what we can see is that the diagnostic materials in the Eastern Bloc are in these turbated gravels, which is the same as what we're seeing in the Western Bloc, but they're also in the unit directly beneath it. Which is interesting because it just may indicate that there's something slightly different going on out here. Below the main cultural deposit, which you can see in these two units, stratigraphic units, we have another kind of sandy unit that has these long stringy areas that have organic rich deposits. And we're interpreting this to be potential relics of marsh plants. So it could be that at some point there was an active marsh, or at least some sort of plants associated with the marsh at the site itself. This is underneath the majority of the cultural deposits. And then the very bottom unit is actually different high stand from the lake with large cobbles. And then what's really exciting is we were actually able to get 2 radiocarbon dates on bone from the eastern part of the unit. And I got to give a big shout out. I actually used the money that I received from the OAS Jones Memorial Scholarship to get these radiocarbon dates. So a big thank you for having that scholarship available, because it really has changed the research that I'm doing at Weed Lake Ditch. And these radiocarbon dates are hot off the presses. You all are the first people who get to hear about them. I actually got them last month, which was really exciting. But I was able to get 2 dates. Unfortunately, because Weed Lake Ditch is an open air site, there aren't really plant materials or charcoal that's well preserved at the site, but there are bone fragments. So I was able to send in several bone samples to Penn State University, to the radiocarbon lab, where they underwent a rigorous pre-treatment process and then went through AMS radiocarbon dating. And the first date that I got is this upper one, and it is on a bone that was recovered just above 2 stem points in the Eastern Bloc, the northeasternmost unit of the Eastern Bloc. So it was found just above those stem points, one of which has parallel oblique flaking, and may be the tip of a Haskett point, but more research needs to be done on that tip before I can definitively say that it is a Haskett. But that date came back at about 12,600 to 12,100 years ago. And that's represented by this graph here. Unfortunately, this is the middle of a carbon plateau. So we don't have a really definitive sharp indication of how explicitly how old it is, but we do have a date range that indicates that this was during the Younger Dryas. And then the second, I should also say too, this is in the same level as the bone needle that we found in 2019, and it is in the same general level as several of the stem points that were found in units adjacent to it. The second radiocarbon date that I got is this lower one, and it is on bone as well. And it is actually substantially beneath the majority of the cultural materials. It's in stratum 7, which is that stratum where we saw some of the potential marsh parts of the site. And the date that we got for this came back at around 12,750 to 12,625. So you can see it's a much more concise range, although this may be a little bit older than the actual age itself. So this specimen had a really high carbon-13 level, which is indicative potentially of either marine influence or, yeah, basically a high trophic level of some kind. So when I ultimately model this radiocarbon date, I'm going to use a mix of both marine and terrestrial calibration to kind of get the best idea of how old it is. Regardless, we can see that stratigraphically they're in order. This radiocarbon date is higher up in the profile and this one is lower. And they generally seem to make sense, which is really exciting. Okay. So now that I've kind of talked about how old the site is, I want to talk about what we're finding. And this is a graph that kind of just shows the different types of artifacts that we're finding at the site itself. It's logarithmic, so the scale bars aren't actually really necessarily super helpful, but it gets you the general idea of the counts. And what we can see is that a majority of the artifacts that we're finding at Weed Lake Ditch are associated with biface manufacture and production, and likely are associated with the production of both Haskett points and crescents on the site itself. But that said, there's a lot of unifacial artifacts, there's a lot of scrapers, unifaces, and a ton of flake tools. So what that's indicating to me is that people aren't using this site for just a short amount of time. They're actually probably living here. I mean, maybe not for an extensive period of time, but they're living here long enough to produce and use a large number of lithic tools on the site, which is really exciting. This kind of shows the actual distribution of the artifacts. So this is the western block. So this is right against the ditch itself. This is Teresa Riston's block. And these are the units that we excavated in 2018. If these 3 units look really sparse, it's because they're the ones we haven't finished excavating. So likely they'll have more artifacts. And then this is the eastern block. And you can see that the majority of the diagnostics that we're finding are from the eastern block itself. And what's really exciting is that we are seeing that there is a direct correlation in this eastern block between crescents and Haskett points, as well as the bone needles. So the radiocarbon date that's associated closest with the diagnostic artifacts actually is coming from right over here in this northeastern unit, and then the lower limiting one is coming from down here in the southern part. I'm still kind of trying to get at what the spatial distribution is actually indicating when we look at the artifacts in this eastern block. But what we can see is that there are a lot of diagnostic tools that are up in this northern part, and this is where the bone needles and the bone beads were found. And then down in the southern part, we're seeing more bifaces and non-diagnostic tools. This unit also needs to be completed, so it's a little bit sparse as well. Okay, so one thing that I want to say about Weed Lake Ditch is that it's a little bit complicated because it's not one of those sites where you can say, I found something 40 centimeters below the surface, therefore it is X years old. What we can see is that there's a definite slope to the site itself. And this kind of shows you the centimeters below our arbitrary datum. And you can see that in the eastern block, we have a spike of artifacts kind of up around 99.25 to 99.1, plus or minus 5 to 10 centimeters on either side. And then in the western block, we have several spikes. So this unit right here, which is further to the east, but is still associated with the western block, has a spike in artifacts kind of around 98.6. And then the far western part has a spike in artifacts even lower than that. And so I believe that all of these artifacts are from the exact same stratigraphic stratum or several stratum, but it's just kind of on a slope that way towards the ditch itself. And I should say the ditch was also likely built on top of where there would have been a natural stream bed. So potentially things are kind of sloping down towards a stream that's entering into the lake itself right there. That said, because I don't have any radiocarbon dates yet from the western part of the site, it could be that I am completely wrong and that there are multiple different occupations at Weed Lake Ditch. But for now, I hypothesize that it's one occupation, and that let me rephrase. It's one general stratum that is being occupied probably repeatedly throughout the end of the Ice Age during the Younger Dryas period. Okay, so now let's look at some of the artifacts itself. So these are several of the Hasketts. These aren't all of the Hasketts that we found, but I just wanted to put this image up because it shows that we actually have the full manufacture sequence for Hasketts at the site. So this artifact is actually a preform, so it's not a completed projectile point, but it shares some commonalities with the Hasketts, including that kind of from the side to the midline flaking. What's really interesting is it looks like this was made on a large flake. So we can kind of look at how Hasketts were being produced at the site. What's also interesting is that we have Hasketts that are made on all sorts of different raw materials. There are Hasketts that are made on obsidians like this one that you can see, as well as different cherts, and then as well as this fine grained volcanic material, which is likely a dacite. Teresa Riston found a Haskett that was made out of a similar material, and she sourced it to the Venator dacite, which is kind of located, it's east and in the uplands, so kind of the North Fork of the Malheur River. So it looks like there are Hasketts that are being produced on a wide range of raw materials, and it also looks like Hasketts are being manufactured at the site itself. Whether they were actively being used to hunt at the site, I don't think they are, but I think that broken Haskett points are being left behind at the site. We can also see that there's a large number of crescent tools. The majority of the crescents are made on a chert, and a lot of this chert is likely local to the site itself. There's a local chert source that's located within 3 to 10 miles, depending on what part of the source you're going to, referred to kind of colloquially as the Eagle's Nest chert. And it's a high quality chert that would have been heat treated before manufacture. And what you can see kind of here is that some of the crescents are truly bifacial. So this one has been really finely flaked on both sides, as well as several of these. But there are also several crescents, these two in particular, that are made on flakes that are kind of expediently flaked along the margins to create that crescent shape. And they likely had a different function than the true bifacial crescents, or at least they were made in much different ways. And so it could be that these were just used as simple cutting and processing tools, although they too could have, I suppose, been hafted if we proposed that they were used to hunt waterfowl. So the majority of the crescents that we have are lunate, so we don't have any eccentric crescents, and there are no butterfly crescents. The majority are either the quarter moon or the half moon. You can see here that the majority of them are the half moon shape. And we also have some kind of like larger bifaces and unifaces that are shaped, including this right here. This isn't actually a uniface, it's not a crescent. I just put it on there for scale to talk about it. That are kind of crescent shaped and that were specifically made into that shape. What is interesting to me are the bifaces that seem to have, the really large bifaces that seem to have this crescent-like shape, because they may be indicative of a larger crescent that is being reduced down into the smaller forms that we see here. So what I propose is that there is both Haskett and crescent manufacture going on at the site itself. So now let's talk a little bit about the bone tools. You can see here, these are the two different bone needles right here that we found, and kind of close-up images of the bone itself. You can see that the bone is really dark. It's very shiny. It was probably, this is partially due to the oils on people's skins. And you can also see that these bones are really root etched, which is similar to the majority of the artifacts that we're finding at the site. So bone needles are found throughout North America in Paleoindian sites. They're found anywhere from Alaska down to Texas. They generally date to the Younger Dryas period, around 1206 to 1030. And most of them are found in Paleoindian sites, and they all are pretty uniform in size. So they're generally 3 to 1 millimeters across, and the diameter of the eye is really uniform and small as well. And you can kind of see from this eye that the way that they would have manufactured these bone needles is by drilling through both sides of the eye, at least in this case, to create the actual eye itself. They're very, very delicate, and that's likely why they broke and were abandoned at the site. You can see this one actually broke across the eye itself, and both of them are broken, and so we don't have any needle tips. Because Paleoindian needles in North America are so delicate, some propose that they would have actually been used potentially to either decorate clothing, or they would have been used, you would have had to punch a hole through before you could thread through to create the clothing. I also found this really interesting bone bead, for lack of a better term. And you can see here that it is really flat on one side, and there's several striations, so it was likely abraded and then polished just through handling on this one side. It is incised down through here, and then it has kind of a protrusion on the end. So it looks like what they did was they kind of incised along here and then snapped along where it was narrowest right here, and that's what we see here is that little protrusion that's the result of that snap. This particular bone bead preform is a little bit different than several of the other ones that have been recovered, including from Weed Lake Ditch and from other Haskett sites throughout the region, because it has this really flat side. And so it's so thin that the chances of them actually snapping it here and then taking the additional step to kind of perforate it again to create a bead with a hole in it seems unlikely to me, although I'm still in the process of trying to like fully figure out what this artifact is. But what I think is potentially that something could have been wrapped around the interior and held on that way, or potentially it is not a bead and it's some sort of other decorative bone artifact. Regardless, it's a really cool find because it's not associated with hunting, and it's just showing that there's a lot of different things going on at Weed Lake Ditch itself. And just so you can see, these are some of the bone bead preforms that were found at Sentinel Gap, which is located in the Columbia Plateau up in Washington. And you can see that they're similar because they have these incised places where they would have snapped, and you can see they have the nubbins along the edge too, but they aren't identical to this. This is much more hourglass shaped and a little bit different. So stay tuned for exciting bone tool research in the future. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about, because I know that I'm kind of going long, sorry about that, is just kind of looking at the rest of the tools that we're finding. And what we can see at Weed Lake Ditch is that we have a full lithic toolkit. And what that means is that we have actual cobbles and cores of raw material. You can see this is a core on the Eagle's Nest chert. And what's kind of cool here is you can see some of the fissures that are actually from the heat treating of the rock itself. So we know that they were heat treating it. But we also have a large number of bifaces that are in various stages of manufacture. So this figure up here is showing just some of the bifaces. It's like a very small number of the bifaces, to be quite honest. And what we can see is that there are some early stage bifaces, like the ones on the bottom, where we can still see some of the exterior of the rock itself. So they haven't flaked all of the outside of the rock off. And then we have several bifaces that are kind of in the mid stages of production, and then smaller bifaces and biface fragments that are late stage manufacture. And what we can see at Weed Lake Ditch is that the majority of the early and middle stage bifaces are chert, and they're likely made on material that is local or semi-local to the site itself. Whereas the late stage bifaces are made on a variety of different materials, including obsidian and fine grained volcanics. So it seems like these were probably either brought to the site or they were in a later state of manufacture in general, compared to some of the chert bifaces that are being produced on the site itself. There are a large number of big obsidian artifacts that we find though, and primarily those are these large scrapers and notched tools. So this has kind of a concavity that would have created a notch, as well as several drills, which you can see down here. And then this is a really small picture of some of the other stemmed artifacts that we're finding at Weed Lake Ditch itself. So the final thing about Weed Lake Ditch is just a quick nod to the faunal materials that we're recovering. So because we're wet screening all of the material, we're able to find and recover a lot more fragmentary bone than we would if we weren't wet screening the materials. Unfortunately, because Weed Lake Ditch is located in an area that was highly turbated at various times, potentially by water, including large storms coming off the lake itself, a lot of the bone is not well preserved, likely because it has been wetted and dried throughout time. And a lot of it is highly, highly fragmentary. So to give you an idea, Teresa Riston found over 14,000 bone fragments when she excavated at Weed Lake Ditch, and only around 500 of them were even identifiable to like a genus or family level. There were some specific bones that were identifiable to species, but the large majority of the bones are so fragmented that they are unidentifiable. We have probably found close to 30 to 40,000 bone fragments. The counting is kind of ongoing because we're still picking through the wet screens. And to give you an idea of why it takes so long to pick through a wet screen, there are some wet screens that come from a 25 by 25 by 5 centimeter level that have over 1,000 bone fragments in them. So we're recovering a lot, and it's going to take a long time to kind of go through it all. But preliminarily, we can say that the majority of the bones that are identifiable in our excavation, as well as in Teresa Riston's excavation at Weed Lake Ditch, tend to be wetland adapted bird species. And there are several specific wetlands adapted species, including the American coot, the Western grebe, and then the Northern pintail, which you can all see here, that have been identified to species level. There are a lot of bones that are simply identified to a general size class, as well as to aves. So we know that they're birds that are around the size of these birds. You can see here that we're actually recovering some fish bone as well, which still needs to be identified. It's various different sizes. There's some that's really, really small and is likely to each hub, but there are definitely other species that are represented. And there's very little bone that is mammal, but we do have some bone that has been identified as rabbit. Teresa Riston, when they did their faunal analysis, they recovered 2 artiodactyl molar fragments, so some sort of deer-sized animal, as well as potentially 4 dog bones, but that is a little bit, needs to be reassessed. So what's interesting when we look at the bird species is it kind of gives us an idea of, one, what the environment likely was around the site. So there was probably marsh and places where these birds would have come, potentially as they're migrating through the region. We also know that at least today, all of these species are generally found at the Malheur Wildlife Refuge from winter through early summer. So it kind of, to a certain extent, does a little bit of constraining in terms of what time of year potentially the site would have been occupied. And I will say that this is really interesting because it kind of seems to match with several other lines of evidence that we're seeing at the site. The first of which is the turbated gravels that are part of the site. Teresa Riston interpreted them to be from storm surges, and they basically, when they were going through the geologic interpretation, basically decided, looking at storms in the present, that we tend to see that storms come from that direction during the winter and early spring. So she thought it was indicative of a late winter, early spring occupation. We also know, just from looking at the ethnographic data, that traditionally people much later in time were using the lake margins during the winter. So traditionally, Paiute people were occupying the margins of Malheur Lake during the winter, collecting waterfowl and various plant species. And so I don't really like to project the ethnographic record back 12,000 years, because likely there are a lot of things that would have changed the environment, would have potentially changed how people were living on the landscape. But we do know that it's not out of the realm of possibility that people would have been living on the landscape in the winter near the lakes, and basically subsisting on the associated marsh resources. So the final thing that I want to talk about is just a quick look at the type of raw material that's being identified at the site. So like I already said, the majority of the artifacts are made on the local chert, but there are obsidian artifacts, and you can see the blue on this map are all sources that have been attributed to artifacts that are coming from Weed Lake Ditch. And then the red is actually from the Nile site, which is located a little bit further east. And a lot of the sources are from the actual basin itself. The majority of them are coming from the northeast of the site, kind of actually over by where Rimrock Draw is. But there are also some sources, including Gregory Creek, that are coming from the uplands. I am still in the process of doing a lot of the raw material identification and the actual geologic sourcing of the artifacts. So likely there will be different sources when that is done. But what was interesting from the initial look at the raw materials is that there's no indication that the larger artifacts are coming from obsidian sources that are closer to the site, or that the smaller, more fragmentary artifacts are coming from sources that are further from the site, which is a pattern that we generally associate with movement throughout a region, is that as you're getting further away from the source, the artifacts that will be left behind will generally be smaller fragmentary pieces, or potentially retouched chips as people are resharpening artifacts. And Weed Lake Ditch doesn't have that pattern, at least right now. That said, none of these sources are necessarily terribly, terribly far away. So that likely will change, but it's an interesting thing to think about now. So just to kind of finish up, I want to kind of put it all together. So our work at Weed Lake Ditch has been really rewarding. we've been able to corroborate the majority of what Teresa Riston was first identifying at the site, but perhaps more importantly, we've been able to actually directly radiocarbon date a bone from the cultural occupation of the site itself. And what that is indicating to me, and what's really exciting about it, is that it is a radiocarbon date associated with the Younger Dryas. So it's much older than Teresa Riston initially thought the site was, about 1,000 years older than her radiocarbon date on the gastropod. But what we are seeing here is that our assemblage really matches the materials that we're seeing at other Haskett sites throughout the region, including sites like the Conley Caves and Sentinel Gap, where there are Haskett points in association with a suite of other lithic tools like scrapers and gravers, as well as bone needles. What's really different at Weed Lake Ditch is that there are a large number of crescents at this site, and that we can say that the crescents and Hasketts are found in association. As far as I know, this is the largest number of crescents that have been found from a buried site, especially from an open air site in the region. And they're also the oldest dated crescents in the region. So that's really exciting because it's just indicating that there's something else that's going on during the Younger Dryas at the end of the last ice age. And then finally, just want to finish up by plugging open air sites once again, just because I think it's really interesting to see that the patterns at sites like Conley Caves are being repeated at this open air site. And it's giving us a much better understanding of the overall landscape use at the end of the Pleistocene. So that is all I have for you. Sorry, I went a little long. Does anyone have any questions? I know that was like a lot of information that I just...
It was fantastic. Thank you very, very much. Yeah, does anybody have any questions? You can put them in the chat. I had a more of a simple observation.
Yeah.
One bone bead preform that had the little lip on it that you weren't really sure if it was a preform or not. To me it looked like either labret or like an earring plug. It totally looked like a spacer.
I didn't go there, but that is something that a lot of people who I've shown that picture to have said. And so for those of you that don't know, labrets are kind of bone plugs. Sometimes they're bone, sometimes they're other material. They're really common in the Pacific Northwest, especially along the Pacific in Washington and British Columbia. And so it could be something like that. I will say it is really, really small. So it's only like it's half a centimeter. So if it is that, it would have been like a very initial one, or like a child's labret. I don't know. I'm not sure. I think I need to do a lot more research on that specific artifact and look at the other artifacts as well. So yeah, we'll see. But yes, you are on.
Not alone. So it looks like we got a question from Corey. He says, how do you go about identifying the geological sources of the artifacts?
That's a great question. So it kind of depends on what type of rock you're looking at. So for the obsidians, each volcanic eruption has a unique geochemical signature. So we can look at different elements within the rock itself and their peaks, and compare them to rocks that we're finding at the source itself where that geologic eruption occurred. And then we can kind of correlate them that way. And we're lucky in the Harney Basin and in Oregon in general because there is a lot of obsidian, and because they are unique, for the most part, we're able to pretty explicitly pinpoint where they are. With other types of rock, it becomes a lot more complicated. So with the cherts in particular, Most of the chert that's been identified at the site, I'm identifying through visual analysis. The Eagle's Nest chert is interesting because it has a lot of fossils in it. Some of it is very oolitic, so you can see kind of different things within the rock itself. And so that's one way to look at it. There's a lot of other different things that you can do with cherts, but they're not necessarily as replicable as it is with obsidian. So it's kind of a combination of visual and actual explicit geochemical sourcing.
Looks like we had another question come in. It says, if you are projecting the site as seasonal in a Binfordian type model, would you see summer, fall as big game type location or potential fish at Malheur and or leading to the Snake River?
That's a good question. So I will say, to start, which isn't really explicitly answering your question, it's a little bit weird to find so many Haskett points in association with so much waterfowl, because traditionally Hasketts have been viewed as a projectile point that could have been used for big game hunting, including for bison and other artiodactyls, none of which we're really finding at the site in large numbers, even though we're finding the artifacts. So likely, yes, they are associated with hunting larger game, and that you would potentially see that happening in the uplands or in other places around the basin. Ethnographically, we know that people are fishing the Malheur and other parts of the basin in the late summer leading up to the winter. So if it is a winter occupation, it might not necessarily be an explicit look for one particular resource, but instead the recognition that if you're on a lake margin, you're at a lower elevation and there are a lot of different things going on, so you may be able to get more resources. I don't know if that fully answers your question, but I would say that as of right now, the seasonality is dubious at best. So it's a little unfortunate. It's not like I have a lot of plant remains or coprolites or something where you can really explicitly see a very small period of occupation. Dubious meaning that it's really it's a hypothesis that needs to be tested. I would not say that this is a definite late winter occupation. It's just a hypothesis that's been proposed so far. Yeah.
Awesome. And we had another one come in from Susan. See, is it possible that the baskets were also hafted or used to dig marsh plants or bulbs?
I don't know of any evidence necessarily that a basket was hafted. They're likely, do you mean a basket or a crescent? Sorry. There's some evidence of perishable materials being used to create nets that could have potentially trapped waterfowl as well as fish. But because I don't really have any perishable materials here, I'm not really sure if that's something that's going on at this site. We would need to look to other places. Potentially they could. There's not a lot of evidence that the Haskett points or the crescents would have been used specifically to actually dig up tubers, just because there's not a lot of evidence that they have like use wear that's indicative of that. Instead, they probably would have been used to process them after they were already dug up. A lot of times when you're digging up resources like that, you can use a more expedient tool that you don't mind if it breaks or something else happens to it.
Fantastic. Are there any more questions out there this evening? Oh, got another one. Are you going back this summer? Oh, there we go.
Yeah, I'm gonna try to go back this summer. All things dependent on COVID. I don't think I'm going to open any more units until I finish all the units that we have open. And because we're wet screening materials, likely even if I went out for a full 6 weeks next summer, we would finish the units that I have open, but I'm not sure if we would have time to open up more units. It wouldn't be a bad idea to open units between the west and east blocks. One thing that I didn't really talk about though is that along the ditch itself, there's a lot of material that's been dumped on top of the ditch from when they actually physically dug it in the like 1920s, with the result that you would have to get through a lot of that like backfill from the ditch before you even got to the surface to dig down. So it's definitely possible, but it's not something that would happen next year. Hopefully I can just go. Oh, COVID.
All right, anybody else this evening? All right, well, that looks like it might be it. I want to thank you again, Jordan. That was fantastic.
Yeah,
Yes.
thank you all so much.
Pause.
Thanks, Jordan. I hope we hear from you before too long.
Yeah,
Keep in
I hope
touch.
so too. Yeah, hopefully I'll be back out there. Maybe I'll see some of y'all if you're out there in the summer too, if Rimrock happens or something else is happening.
Take care.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everybody. See you next month.